After my controlling stepdad seized control of my late grandparents' bookstore instead of me, I severed ties with my mom when she sided with him. Now she's desperately seeking my assistance because his attempt has ended in failure. Hi, I'm a 28-year-old woman who has been estranged from my parents for nearly 7 years. The rift started after my grandpa passed away, and my mom chose to let my stepdad take over the local bookstore they owned. My dad died suddenly of a heart attack when I was 3, leaving everyone in shock. After his death, my paternal grandparents severed ties with my mom, never seeing her again. My grandparents took me and my mom in, and we lived with them for a few years. My mom had been a stay-at-home mom since I was born, so finding a job was tough. When she did find work, it was low-paying, and she had to work twice as hard to make ends meet. She could have run the bookstore with her parents, but she thought it wouldn't be profitable and saw it more as a hobby than a career. Eventually, she started working as a saleswoman for a stationery company, and after a couple of years, she saved enough to afford her own place. When I was around 6 or 7, we moved out of my grandparents' house and into a place of our own. Until then, it had been just me and my mom, who was deeply focused on her work and still grieving my dad. I often saw her looking at his photos and crying, and it was clear how much she loved him. After we settled into our new home, she began dating again. At first, I was upset, worried that I would be put second. Maybe it was just a gut feeling, but I had a sense that something bad was going to happen. Despite these feelings, I never let my emotions show, and I was always polite to her boyfriends. I never let her know that I was uncomfortable with the frequent changes in her dating life. As a progressive woman myself, I've had my share of flings and casual relationships, but I always thought twice before introducing someone to my child. It baffled me that my mother never seemed to consider that. Every other week, there was a new guy. I didn't know what she was trying to achieve, but it never sat right with me. I stayed silent because I didn't want to hurt her feelings. She had worked hard and grieved enough, and as a child, I didn't know how to express my discomfort without sounding like a brat. So I kept my thoughts to myself, scared of making her feel worse. When I was around 12, my mom started dating Steven. At first, he seemed like a nice guy. He came over a few times, and we got along well. He was kind to me, and I thought, like her previous relationships, this one would fizzle out in a few weeks. But surprisingly, months went by, and they continued to see each other. As their relationship grew more serious, Steven came over more often, occasionally staying for dinner or even the night. Naturally, I interacted with him more and noticed he was quite different from the men my mom had dated before. He seemed genuinely serious about her, which I liked, but I also sensed something off. Steven had a very dominating and assertive personality, which isn't necessarily bad, but my mom started changing in ways that seemed to cater to him. Whenever he was around, she transformed into someone else. It was like I didn't recognize her. She would try to agree with him on everything, almost like a smitten teenager trying to impress a senior in high school. It was unsettling. Whenever I was around them, I felt like I was intruding on something very personal. Even when they were just sitting together, I had never seen my mom act this way with the other guys she had dated. She seemed to like them, but she never went out of her way to change herself to be more likable. With Steven, it was different, and it made me uncomfortable. At the time, I was just a kid, and even though I sensed something was wrong, I couldn't bring myself to talk to my mom about it. She was my mother, and there were certain topics that felt inappropriate for a 12-year-old to discuss. So I kept quiet, even around my grandparents. They asked me a few times about how things were going with Steven and if I liked him, and I always gave answers I knew my mom would approve of. After about a year of dating, Steven moved in with us, and that's when things really started to change. He redecorated our house, making it more gender-neutral, as he put it. While it might have made sense if our house was overly pink or frilly, it wasn't. We had decorated our home in a pretty standard, neutral style, but Steven decided everything needed to be more masculine. By the time he was done, our house looked like a bachelor pad. He was thrilled, saying it reminded him of home. I didn't understand how that was a good thing, considering he used to live with younger roommates. I wanted to complain, but my mom told me not to, and since my room was left untouched, I figured it was okay. But then, slowly, he started changing other things as well. Steven convinced my mom to stop eating meat, claiming it was bad for her health, and that he didn't want her to gain weight. So they both became vegetarians and tried to get me to join them. Thankfully, I was at school most of the time, and I told him I needed protein to keep up with my energy levels, so they didn't push me much. It wasn't necessarily a bad change, but my mom had been a huge fan of hamburgers and meat dishes before she met Steven, so it was a big sacrifice for her. He also insisted she cut out sugar, which made her extremely cranky. This was tough for me because she wouldn't get mad at him but would snap at me over the smallest things. He introduced various other healthy lifestyle changes, often based on random internet readings that he would blow out of proportion. He was a really peculiar man, but my mom seemed to like him, and as long as he was happy, I didn't want to say anything. Besides, he wasn't forcing me to change anything, so I figured I was okay with it. Then they got married. A few months after the wedding, my mom announced she was quitting her job because she was pregnant again. I was thrilled about the prospect of having a little sibling, but I was also concerned about her quitting her job. The control Stephen seemed to exert over her was worrying. Nothing had gone wrong yet, but I didn't think it was safe for her to rely entirely on her husband. I tried several times to convince her not to quit, but she dismissed my concerns, telling me it was none of my business and that I, as a child, should stick to things that kids do and not interfere. Eventually, I stopped trying to talk to her about it. She was a grown woman, and I figured she knew what was best for her. I was also frustrated with her constantly telling me to stay out of things that didn't concern me. She didn't seem to understand that her decisions affected me too, as I was part of the family. I was probably 15 or 16 at the time, so it wasn't like I was just a kid. In the end, I decided to stay out of it and mind my own business. Unfortunately, my mother lost the baby around 3 months into the pregnancy. It was devastating for her, and the whole family took it hard. She was in her late 30s, and the doctors attributed the complications to her advanced age. Stephen was extremely disappointed, and there was a tough period in their marriage after the loss where they slept in separate rooms and barely spoke to each other. It was heartbreaking because my mother was already dealing with such a profound loss, and the one person she should have been able to rely on wasn't even communicating with her. Stephen told her he needed some space to process everything, so for several months they essentially became flatmates, barely discussing anything beyond household necessities. Their conversations were limited to bills and groceries, and that was about it. During that difficult time, my mother really opened up to me, which helped us reconnect. Unfortunately, this made things even worse when she eventually forced me to cut ties with her. When Stephen wasn't speaking to her, she reached out to me and my grandparents, and we were there to support her. Around the same time, my grandmother fell ill, which likely played a role in my mother's efforts to reconnect with us. A couple of months later, my grandmother passed away, and just a few weeks after the funeral, Stephen started making an effort to cheer my mom up. They began to rebuild their relationship, but I had already lost faith in him. I began to dislike Stephen because he had really lost my respect when he ignored my mother after the loss of the baby. I thought it was a low blow, and after that, I had no intention of trying to mend our relationship. During the time he was cold to my mother, he also started ignoring me. We had even less to talk about than he did with my mom, so we were practically not on speaking terms. After my grandmother's passing, Stephen tried to repair his relationship with my mother, but by then, I had already made up my mind about him. I knew I didn't like him and couldn't trust him. About a year later, I left for college, and by then, Stephen and my mother were in marriage counseling and were doing well. On weekends, I would visit them, splitting my time between my mom and my grandpa. He was really lonely after my grandma passed, so I felt it was important to stay close to him. He was managing the bookstore alone, and I had started considering taking over the business and handling its finances after I graduated. However, I never got that chance because a few weeks before my graduation, I got the news that my grandfather had passed away in his sleep. While I was relieved he had gone peacefully, I was upset that I hadn't had the chance to say a final goodbye. At the funeral, my mother told me that my grandfather's lawyer, who was the executor of his will, had informally mentioned that she was set to inherit the bookstore. Apparently, my grandpa hadn't updated his will before he passed, so my mother was going to inherit the house where my grandparents had lived and where I had spent much of my childhood. Even after moving out with my mom, we would still visit them frequently. I was glad to be inheriting the house, and knowing my mother had no interest in running a bookstore, I planned to ask her to let me take over. I thought it would be a good starting point for me. The bookstore wasn't struggling, it was still getting customers and doing decently well. A couple of weeks after the funeral, once the will had been read, I decided to talk to my mother about it. However, she told me that she had already spoken to Stephen, and he had decided to take over instead. I found that extremely unfair. Legally, the bookstore was hers, but I felt she should have allowed me to run it. I tried to explain that I had a special bond with my grandparents, and when my grandpa was alone after grandma passed, I had been helping him with the bookstore's finances. I knew the business well and felt it would have been fair to at least be a 50-50 partner with Stephen if that was what my mother wanted. But she was very stubborn, insisting that she had already promised Stephen he could take over and that he planned to turn it into a franchise and take it to new heights. She told me to stay out of his way. Honestly, I didn't believe Stephen had the capability to expand the business. We were one of the few bookstores still thriving, so the idea of turning it into a franchise seemed far-fetched and unachievable for now. I felt it would be better to start small and improve our single location. We had many arguments about this, but a few days later, my mother told me her decision was final and that no amount of arguing would change her mind. She said I was getting on her last nerve and needed to back off. She insisted she knew her own parents well and that they would want the same thing Stephen wanted. She told me to stay out of it because I didn't understand the situation as well as she did. She mentioned that Stephen had been struggling at his job and had been thinking about quitting for a while. Now, with the bookstore as a backup, he had the chance to make a fresh start. She told me I wasn't going to take that opportunity away from him. She demanded I drop all ideas of taking the business from him, and if I couldn't do that, I should leave them alone since I was an adult and could handle my own life. That was a hurtful thing to say, especially to defend Stephen. My mother and I had a terrible fight, and we haven't spoken since. That day, I left the house, and after graduating, I never heard from or texted my mother again. She made it clear that I either had to accept Stephen running the bookstore or leave, so I chose to leave and stuck to my decision. 7 years have passed since then, and a lot has changed. I graduated, moved into my own apartment, got my first job, and started seeing my boyfriend, Dean, a couple of years ago. Life has been good, and I don't mind how things turned out. Of course, I occasionally miss my mother, but then I remember what she said the day I left, and I stopped thinking about her. I'd like to say I had completely forgotten about my mom and healed from everything, but that's not entirely true. I didn't mind her not speaking to me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she chose Stephen over me. Deep down, I always knew that if it came down to it, she would pick Stephen. I had hoped I was wrong, and when I wasn't, it shattered any illusions I had about my mother and ended our relationship. Without my grandparents around, I had no reason to keep in touch with her. 7 years passed with no news of my mother or any idea of how she was doing. Since I moved to a different part of the city and we didn't have overlapping circles, I had already told my relatives that I didn't want to hear anything about her. I just wasn't interested because it would only hurt me. To sum it up, I didn't know anything about what my mother had been up to in the past 7 years since I cut ties with her. But a couple of weeks ago, I heard from one of my cousins that my mother had been asking around for my phone number and address because she wanted to know if it was okay to tell me she wanted to visit. I found it a bit odd, but I had changed my number after I left and blocked her on all social media, so this was the only way she could reach me. After some thought, I told my cousin I was okay with it because I really wanted to know what my mother wanted to talk to me about after all this time. I told her to go ahead and give my mother my address. The next day, my mother visited me alone. I was a little surprised that Stephen wasn't with her, but then again, we had never been particularly close, so it wasn't entirely unexpected. My mother and I had a tearful reconciliation, and we started talking. I told her all about my life and introduced her to Dean. She kept asking about my job and how I was doing financially, which I found a bit strange, but I figured it was natural for a mother to want to know how her child was doing. The only thing that felt a bit off was that we hadn't been in touch for almost 7 years, and all she seemed interested in was how much I was getting paid at my job. She probably noticed I wasn't struggling, given my comfortable lifestyle, which was evident from how I had decorated my home. As she kept asking me subtle questions, I started to suspect that maybe she had ulterior motives for visiting. Eventually, she dropped any pretense and revealed her true intentions. She told me she was glad to hear I was doing well financially because she really needed my help. She admitted that the bookstore business wasn't doing well and Stephen was struggling to keep it afloat. His plans to expand and turn it into a franchise had failed. He now had multiple locations, but none were selling, and he had borrowed a lot of money from friends and family, which he now had to repay. He had invested all their money into the business, but there were no returns, and they were struggling to pay their bills. They couldn't fathom the consequences if their friends and family started demanding repayment of the money they had borrowed. They were in serious financial trouble and wanted me to bail them out. My mother said she had come to see me to discuss this, and during our conversation, she had already figured out that I had a decent income and might be able to help them, at least a little. To make matters worse, she then pointed at my boyfriend and suggested that since he was going to be part of the family, he could contribute too to help keep the family business afloat. I don't know why my mother thought I would help her out like that, but as soon as I realized she had come only for assistance and not to make amends, I told her she could leave because I wasn't interested. To be clear, if she had come with the genuine intention of repairing our relationship and making up for the time lost, I might have considered helping her. But her sole focus on my money and the fact that she had dragged Dean into this just didn't sit right with me. I asked her to leave and we ended up in another fight. She called me selfish and ungrateful, saying she regretted even trying to reach out to me. I didn't hold back either and unleashed all my frustration from when I was a child. After she left, Dean had to help me calm down for almost an hour because I was so worked up. It frustrated me that only my mother had shown up to ask for help when it was actually Stephen who had messed everything up. I was just really angry about so many things, which is why I refused to help them. My mother and I had a strained relationship ever since she married Stephen, and it had reached a breaking point nearly 7 years ago. I had hoped things would improve, but they didn't, and my disappointment and anger got the better of me, leading me to turn my mother away. She didn't speak to me again until a couple of days ago. I had almost forgotten about the whole episode until she called me and said that now they had no choice but to give up the business and sell everything because they were really struggling financially. They had told everyone they borrowed money from that the business wasn't doing well and everyone wanted their money back. She made it sound like it was all my fault, telling me that if I had just helped her out that day, not even for her sake but for my grandparents, then this wouldn't have happened. But now they don't have anything left to give and selling is their only option. I know I shouldn't feel guilty, but I do, and I can't shake the feeling that I've let my grandparents down. I know how much that bookstore meant to them, and it meant just as much to me. The thought of it slipping out of our hands is incredibly hard to deal with. I could do something now, but I feel like my mother and Stephen haven't asked for help, and I don't want to go back on my word. Yet I don't want to let the business go either because then I'd feel like a total jerk. So I'm stuck, hesitating over whether to bail my parents out, given the business that they took over instead of me isn't doing well. Update 1. Hi, first off, thank you all so much for the comments on my post. After much thought, I've decided I won't help my mother directly. However, like many of you suggested, I couldn't stand the idea of letting my parents ruin my grandparents' legacy. They had put so much hard work into their business, and I wasn't going to let that be squandered. So I reached out to a friend and together, we decided to buy them out. I'm not going to screw my mother out of a fair price, and my friend, who's quite wealthy due to his restaurant business inherited from his father, is interested in expanding. A couple of months ago, he had been looking to expand, and he thought a bookstore plus cafe would be a great addition. So, they're buying my parents out, and since I approached him with this idea, I'll be their partner. The only thing left now is to speak to my mom. I'm just hoping she hasn't found any other buyers yet because that would complicate things. It seems unlikely though since it's only been a few weeks. I'm guessing nothing has been finalized yet. Anyway, I'm keeping my fingers crossed and hoping for the best. Update 2. So it's been 2 days since my last update and half an hour ago, I just got off a phone call with my mother. I told her about the idea my friend and I had, and I made it clear that this would be a purely business deal. I was speaking to her in a professional capacity, and she actually seemed open to the idea. She said she would talk to Stephen and let us know, so I think this is going to happen now. It's really exciting because I had always wanted something like this, and now it seems like it's actually going to materialize. Dean and I are already celebrating. Update 3. Okay, so it's been a couple of weeks since my last post here, but I've been really busy because my mother and Stephen agreed to our deal. They got their way out of the business, and now my friend and I have already taken over. There's a lot of renovation to be done, and we're overseeing all of it. It's a long way until we start making money off of this, but I'm hopeful. I know my grandparents are going to be proud of me, and I just have this feeling that this is all going to work out for the best. I can't explain it, but I just know it. Now all I need is everybody's blessings. Thank you so much to everyone who was there all along with me. Thank you for all the lovely comments and messages. It really means the world to me,